Great. You hear me all right? Even you guys in the back, give me a wave. All right. Excellent. Good, good, good. Yeah, well, it's a pleasure to be here. I'm really glad to be able to talk to you this morning. As you've probably learned, I have just retired from a 35-year career at NASA, where I did some pretty cool stuff. And so I'm going to tell you a little bit about that and a little bit about how I see the future. Especially, I think this is especially important because the last 10 years of my career were spent part of the NASA team that's planning the future of human and robotic space exploration. So you guys will get a little inside info on where things are headed and why that's the case. And hopefully at the end you'll be interested in pursuing a career in space, or if not, just become a fan of the space program. So anyway, I'm really glad to be here with you today. So as I mentioned, I started at NASA right after I graduated. I went to the University of Notre Dame and studied electrical engineering. And I started working on the space shuttle program. My job there was to be responsible for the payloads that would go inside the payload bay. So I would work with the owners of experiments, or sometimes they were deployed like satellites. Sometimes they were small experiments inside a bigger laboratory, which we called Space Lab. Sometimes they were bigger experiments that were like big radar antennas that opened at the full length of the shuttle payload bay. So my job was to work with these payload customers and understand what their requirements were, and then talk to all the shuttle team members about how to get their requirements met. Like some needed to be pointed here, so we had to move the shuttle. Some needed thermal conditions that meant we had to point in a certain direction. Some needed to look at the Earth. Some needed to rotate. So there's all sorts of different requirements they had. And I worked with the shuttle team to make sure that the requirements could be met. And a lot of times I worked with the astronauts too, so that they had to operate the payloads in space. And so I had to make sure they understood what was required, what would be necessary to meet the requirements of the payload customer. And that was a lot of fun. You know, that was, I grew up in Virginia, and I remember, and this job was in Houston. I remember driving down to Texas on my first day, thinking, oh my gosh, this place is so different from anything I'd known. You know, it's just so hot and humid, and, you know, hardly any trees. I'll stay for 1 year and then I'll go back to God's country, I thought. But then, you know, you get down there and you get into it, and it's really exciting. 5 years went by before I realized before I really thought about it. So it was a lot of fun to work on the shuttle program. Then I transitioned to the space station program. After about 5 years on the shuttle program, we had the very first accident where we lost the crew, the Challenger accident. And during the process of recovery of that, from that mission, understanding what went wrong and why, I decided to switch to the space station program and be part of an effort to design something big. So I moved to the space station program and was part of because I had worked in space shuttle operations, I was part of the operations preparation effort for the space station. And so we were trying to figure out how we were going to operate the space station, how we're going to design a space station that was going to be operable and efficiently. So that was a lot of fun. It got me into a different kind of work. Then I moved to system engineering, and system engineering was really about how all the pieces went together and identifying and resolving issues with the space station assembly. And I did that for a couple of years. And then I met a guy that worked for the European Space Agency. And the European Space Agency was a partner of NASA's on the space station program, as was the Japanese Space Agency and the Canadian Space Agency at the time. And we got married. And about a year later, he got transferred back home to Europe, and NASA had one liaison position at his home facility, which I was able to get. And so I went and spent 10 years overseas working for NASA. So that was a great experience. I was embedded with the European Space Agency team that was designing their module for the space station. and their equipment for the space station. They were also developing an automated logistics vehicle, which was sort of like robotically, operated on its own. It launched on its own from a launch pad in South America, found its way to the space station and docked autonomously. And I was responsible for integrating that. So it docked to the Russian side of the space station. By now we had invited the Russians to be part of the program, and this vehicle docked to the Russian side. So I spent a bunch of time in Russia working issues with this vehicle, and got to know the Russians very well. That was a lot of fun. Then I moved back to, after 10 years in Europe, I moved back to Houston, and I had a couple of different jobs in space station management, let's say. And then I was asked to go lead a group of scientists and medical doctors. This was a directorate at Johnson Space Center. Mr. Camarda, who's probably there, was in charge of the engineering directorate at a time during his career. This was a directorate that was sort of a sister directorate, a lot smaller than his, but we were responsible for the human health and performance. And I was the deputy director there. And then about that time, NASA was deciding to pursue again really aggressively sending people back to the moon. So going beyond low Earth orbit. So we had space station in orbit for about 10 years, and we were looking forward to what was next. And we concluded that the private sector was innovating and investing in space capabilities. Teams like Elon Musk and SpaceX. You guys have all seen Elon Musk and SpaceX, right? So you know what they're doing. They were just starting out, and we were convinced that through the investments of NASA and our partners, people in the private sector could understand the risks and and the technologies were mature enough so that the private sector could build these capabilities. It didn't just have to be NASA. Government money is really useful when you're advancing technologies, when you're pushing the envelope. But, with low Earth orbit, we felt like the technologies were mature enough, and sure enough, SpaceX was proving that we were right. So we were starting to prepare this transition where, low Earth orbit, where the space station would ultimately be an area that was full of private space stations. And NASA would lead exploration beyond low Earth orbit. So I was part of this human health and performance directorate, and we was asked to start something called the Human Research Program, which was how do we focus the research that we have going on really applied problems. How do we solve the risk of bone loss and muscle loss and other human health risks associated with spending a long time in microgravity in the extreme environment far away from Earth. So I got that program started. And then about that time, NASA was really gearing up a program that was called the Constellation Program. That was the first program to go back to the moon and then onto Mars. And so I was asked to join that program, which I did. And a couple years later, it was canceled. When President Obama came in, he said, look, let's step back and let's advance technologies and let's wait a little bit before we build the kind of capabilities we need to go back to the moon. He didn't dispute that going back to the moon and Mars was the right thing, but he wasn't ready to invest in specific capabilities. So we stepped back and it started a period of planning, right? And I was part of that team where we planned. So as part of that effort, we looked at, where can we go? What are the destinations? So we had moon, we had asteroids, and we had Mars on our list of achievable destinations. And, there's other really cool places in the solar system, but when you think about the technologies that we have or we could expect to have in the next 10 or 15 years, we didn't think that anything beyond Mars was realistically achievable. In fact, Mars was the farthest place we could even begin to imagine how to explore. We knew we didn't have the technologies or the risk mitigation capabilities to go to Mars, but we thought we could imagine how to do it. So it became a driver. So anyway, we started this planning activity, and I was heavily into that. And so because of all my experience overseas, right, I had worked with the European, Japanese, Russians, Canadians on the space station, and I had also lived in Europe for 10 years. I was asked to be part of the team that did this planning work, but also engaged with the international space agencies so that we could bring them into the effort. Right, we wanted to explore with our partners. They were partners on the space station program, and we couldn't imagine not exploring with them. They brought so much in terms of capability and good ideas and resources to the effort. So we engaged them in the planning activity. And we also decided we wanted to engage new space agencies like the Koreans or the Australians or the United Arab Emirates. They have a lot of money and an interest in space. So we engaged a bunch of different space agencies. So that's what I was doing, right? So, and it really represented, it was the last 8 years of my career. So I could take the experience I had from the first 25 years, working these technical issues and managing programs and projects, and apply that to planning for the future. And I was really motivated to do that and to make a plan that was sustainable, right? Meaning one that could survive for decades and decades to come because of, people like you. I really felt like I had a great career advancing the U.S. space program, and I wanted to make sure it was just as exciting for your generation. So it was a lot of fun. So let me talk a little bit about where we got to and where NASA is headed now. So we looked at, because the canceled Constellation program that I mentioned was focused on the moon, we shifted and looked a little bit harder at asteroids and Mars. So we looked at how could we get people to asteroids? What would be involved? And how many targets were there? What was the composition? And we found that there are a category of asteroids that are called near-Earth asteroids. So they have an orbit which brings them close enough to Earth, like within the distance between us and say, Mars, periodically. The passageways in the time that they're in this area that's close enough to Earth isn't very long, but it was long enough to be considered meaningful. But the more we looked, the more we realized there were hardly any of these targets, and they didn't come very often. But asteroids are very interesting, right? Because there are several types of asteroids. You probably learned through your studies that there are asteroids that are full of minerals. There are asteroids that are full of volatiles. In fact, there are theories that said asteroids are kind of the remnants of, are the kind of thing that brought the basic building blocks to Earth when the Earth was forming. So we were very interested, the scientists were very interested in studying asteroids, and there became a small community of people who said, hey, let's try to mine these asteroids. Once NASA started talking more about asteroid mission studies, there were people who, entrepreneurs who said, let's try to mine these asteroids. As we studied the problem a bit more, it became clear that it was going to be very hard to do that. Again, like I said, the number of targets and the period between visits to Earth was just made it too, not interesting enough for the kind of investment and capabilities we were talking about. And then we looked at Mars, sending people to Mars, and sending people to Mars. We've sent robotic missions to Mars, right? The U.S. has landed a number of spacecraft on Mars. We still have a couple operating today, and other nations have been working hard to send spacecraft to and onto the surface of Mars. And Mars is our sister planet. It had an atmosphere one day back, long billions of years ago. What happened to it? It had probably neutral water billions of years ago. What happened to it? So we felt that studying Mars would help us learn whether there was potential for life today or in the past, but also help us understand what might be the future of Earth? What kind of, what does the solar wind interaction with an atmosphere look like? And what does that mean for our atmosphere? Those kinds of things. So we felt that that there was a lot of reasons to send people to Mars, to justify the investment. And those are just the scientific reasons. There's also, the fact that, there's another rationale which says, hey, if we are a single planet species, we aren't going to survive in the long term. So we need to be thinking about that. And while that was never a big driver to the today, that was there is still a case to be made that is one of the rationales for going to Mars. So we looked at what it would take to get to Mars, but to get to Mars, it takes 6 months with current technologies or technologies that we could imagine, right? It takes, say, 5 or 6 months to get there. Then you have to spend a year on the surface of Mars while you wait for the planets to align for the quickest transit back. And then the transit back is another 5 or 6 months. So that was a long mission. It was going to be at least 2-year mission. And, if you think about the basic capabilities you need for that mission, like life support systems, we then looked at the International Space Station and found that life support systems were not the most reliable systems on the space station. We're spending a lot of money and effort repairing and replacing life support system components. So we know we need to invest in better life support systems. Yeah, we can get a closed loop life support system working, but to survive a 2-year mission, you probably have to bring a whole module full of spares. And is that the right way to do it? And we concluded no. So we stepped up our investment in closed loop life support equipment. In propulsion, we stepped up our investments in propulsion technology to see if we could find ways to get there faster. And there are a lot of people, there are some efforts studying things like nuclear thermal propulsion and other solar electric or electric propulsion options. So it may be someday that there are propulsion advances that will help us get there faster. So let's see. But and then once you get to Mars, pretty much the crew would have to bring everything that they'd need. You'd have to have a capability to launch them off the planet and get them 6 months there, and all the equipment, land their habitat on the surface, bring enough stuff so they could do science and have a meaningful mission, and then have a capability to get off the surface of the planet and come back. And the investment in all those capabilities was really, given where we are today, was considered to be, unaffordable. Even if we got all the nations in the world that were interested in it together to do it, it was considered unaffordable. So then we began focusing on the moon again. And the moon, it turns out, is a lot closer. So but it carries along with it the same challenges and opportunities as Mars. So it gives us a chance to advance technologies and test our lunar mining capabilities, test our extraterrestrial mining capabilities on the moon. It gives us a chance to test our human robotic interaction concepts on the moon, and all of these things we can do while learning about the moon, which is very interesting scientifically. So during Apollo, the crew came back, and the consensus of the day was it was really a barren body with not that much to see and not that much to learn. But since then, we have had a number of robotic spacecraft orbiting the moon, and a couple that have landed on the moon that have sent back information to tell us otherwise. There are a lot of resources on the moon. Not only are there volatiles like water ice at the poles that we're interested in. There's oxygen that's bound up in the regolith. There are other minerals and rare earth materials that are there that we've seen from orbital data, right? So we've seen from spectrometers on robotic spacecraft. But we don't really have a good understanding of exactly the nature of these resources and how well they're distributed. Are they really embedded into the regolith and going to be hard to mine, or are there deposits that are going to be relatively relatively easy to mine. So we need to send robotic spacecraft to the moon to figure that out, and NASA's working on doing that. So again, the resources, then the resource potential of the moon is one of the scientific rationale, but also the moon, the main theory of the formation of the moon was that it was formed at the time the Earth was formed. So it's a remnant of the formation of Earth. And because it doesn't have active geological processes, you know, the moon, what happened to the moon over the last, say, 4 billion years, 5 billion years, is the record of that is on the moon today. And so there are a lot of reasons to go and study and bring back samples to understand, you know, what was carried through space to the moon, and what happened to it. And so the science community believes that by studying the moon, we can learn more about the formation of the Earth-Moon system and the formation of the rocky planets in our solar system. So, you know, there's a lot of scientific rationale to go back to the moon, and there are potentially resources that can help us on Earth and with exploration beyond low Earth orbit. So now we're focused on going back to the moon, and we've gotten an international consensus on that. So space agencies around the world are super interested in participating. So there are countries that are building their own small robotic landers, and there are countries that are doing studies for human capabilities on the moon. So the Japanese, for example, the Japanese Space Agency is working with Toyota, the car company, to advance a concept for we're calling it a pressurized rover, but it's a lunar rover that can carry 2 or 4 astronauts, probably 2, and move around on the moon. That takes advantage of Toyota's technology with cars, but also advanced technology that you need to keep people alive on a different planetary surface. So the Japanese are investing in something like that. But the main difference with let's say how we plan to go to the moon now and how we went to the moon during the Apollo program is, you know, one thing that Elon Musk has shown, SpaceX has shown, that you know, reusability is achievable. You know, have you guys seen the way they fly back those boosters when they launch a Falcon 9 or the Falcon 9 Heavy, where they fly back the core and the 2 strap-on boosters? That's pretty amazing, right? And so the work that SpaceX has done has really transformed the thinking and the whole community to one of reusability. You know, we've got to figure out a way to reuse these systems. I mean, a rocket engine itself is tens of millions of dollars, right? So you can imagine if you're going to be launching a bunch of stuff into space and throwing away the rocket engines every time, the price adds up, and you're quickly going to you're quickly going to hit the boundaries of your budget. So you need to figure out a way to reuse. So when you think about reusability, what does that mean in exploration of the moon? What NASA, where we got to was, let's have a little node, or a gateway, we call it, in a stable orbit around the moon. There are several stable orbits around the moon. There are orbits called Lagrangian points, and there are other orbits that take advantage of the balance between the gravity of the moon and the gravity of Earth. And what if we put a little gateway in one of these stable orbits, and we use that as sort of a staging post? So we can reuse equipment and spacesuits and things that we take down to the surface of the moon. We can reuse landers, because we can leave them at the gateway and they can stay there and be refueled. We can even use this gateway when we want to send people to Mars, right? We can have this Mars spacecraft leave from the gateway and then come back to the gateway and be refurbished and reused for the next trip to Mars. So the gateway, the lunar gateway, is the first step in an architecture, if you will, for exploring not only the moon but also Mars through a reusable approach. And one of the key enablers, let's say, would be if we can figure out a way to extract this water ice on the moon and turn that into propellant, right? You can break down water into hydrogen and oxygen, and if you can turn that into cryogenic propellant, you've got you don't have to bring it from Earth, right? You don't have to bring it from Earth, and that is very helpful, especially for exploration of the moon. So what NASA is doing now is starting to build this gateway. You know, they have a contract out for the power and propulsion element, they call it, but it's the solar arrays and the ability to point the gateway and maneuver the gateway and provide power to the gateway and communication services to the gateway. And they're pretty close to finalizing a contract for a small little habitat module with some docking ports on it. And these two elements will be the first starting point for the gateway. And they should be in space by 2023, 2024. So, you know, it takes probably 5 years when you're thinking optimistically about developing a space capability like this. So by 2024, this first gateway ought to be in orbit, in a stable orbit around the moon. And then NASA has also solicited for human landers. So there are companies, in fact, that just turned in proposals for the human landers this week to NASA. And the idea is to build a lander that takes people to the surface of the moon by 2024. And the first mission NASA is very excited to say that there'll be at least one woman on this mission. So that's pretty nice and pretty exciting. But follow-on missions would happen at least once a year and bring more men and women to the surface of the moon. So this first mission in 2024 will demonstrate the technologies of a lander. You know, we built a lander during Apollo. In fact, during the Constellation program I told you about, I was the project manager for the lunar lander, which was called Altair at the time. Charlie probably remembers it, but it was very big, 45 metric tons. It was gigantic, and it was going to bring 4 people to the surface of the moon. And during that time, me and my team, we spent a lot of time with Apollo engineers and astronauts to understand the challenges of Apollo. And what we found was, you know, they did a lot of things right, but technology had advanced since then, and that was sort of a double-edged sword. We had extra capabilities, but we also had the ability to manage risks that they didn't. You know, they were pretty lucky. But once you have the ability to manage risks, you want to manage the risks, and that makes things heavier and bigger and more complex. So yes, we did this back 50 years ago, but technological advancements allow us to do things in a way that will make it, we use the word sustainable, but will ensure that we can have a system that we can build on and do more with as time goes on. So anyway, the lunar lander studies that are out, the lunar lander contracts that NASA will let in the next couple of months are along those lines, learning the lessons from Apollo, but you know, bringing in new ideas and new technologies to be able to do more, to take more people to the surface of the moon and stay longer, bring back more payloads, those kinds of things. And one of the first areas of interest of people when people get to the moon is this idea of mining the water ice. So I think you've been studying space mining or thinking about space mining, but there's a lot of effort that's going into understanding how to mine this water ice, right? So we know, as I said, we know from orbital data that it should be there, and there are some data sets that say that it's fairly abundant in certain places. Like there are these craters that never see the sun, right? They're deep enough that they never see the sun, so they're super cold. So the scientists think that over time, you know, volatiles are transported in the solar wind, and then they migrate to these cold traps at the lunar poles, and they get in these permanently shadowed regions inside lunar craters, and they're in a fairly high concentration. So the orbital data supports that theory, but it's not conclusive. So we really want to get some ground truth, we say. So we really want to send robotic missions to the surface of the moon and explore and see what's there. So in the next couple years, you'll see missions to the moon. You'll see a lot of missions really trying to understand, how much water's there and can we use it? How complicated would it be to make fuel? So that's an overview of sort of where we're headed and a little bit of why. And I hope you found that interesting. And now I'll stop and see if you have any questions.
Oh, I have to tell you, what you just shared with us is absolutely amazing. The students are just starting research projects, and they're all doing different avenues of research, and you touched upon basically most of what they are going to be studying. So that was amazing. We only have a few minutes, but I wanted to give them a chance to ask a couple of questions. And Charlie, would you like to, is it on? Oh, this one's,
okay.
test. Can you guys hear me?
Kathy, how are you doing? Hello again, and thank you for doing this for our students. And I'm going to ask the students now if there are any questions you have, Kathy.
So why are private companies focused on Mars while the government is focused on the moon?
I'm sorry, I can't hear you. So maybe put the mic closer. For some reason.
Why
This
are
one's
private companies
working, right?
No, Christine, maybe I can hear you. Maybe you could repeat the question.
Yeah, this mic is working. So what is your question?
I mean, the mic is working, but I hear words, but I can't tell what they are.
You're just going to have to lock up there. Kathy, can you hear from this mic okay?
I can hear you, but I'm also familiar with your voice, so I think that's part of it.
Okay.
Okay, the microphone is right there, so just talk
Okay,
loud.
so the question was, I'll try to repeat it to make it easier. The question was, how come the government is focused on the moon and a lot of commercial companies are focused on going to Mars?
Okay, I heard that. Okay, so Elon Musk is really the only guy that is focused on going to Mars. And it is a personal dream of his to enable people to get to Mars. And he's got the resources to invest to do it. So he is investing in the capabilities to get people to Mars. The government is, when the government spends public money, it spends taxpayers' money, right? And the government's job is not to help Elon Musk be successful. The government's job is to balance the needs of a bunch of stakeholder communities and advance technologies and find new knowledge and open up new markets, new economy, expand the economic sphere of Earth. And the work that NASA has done, that governments around the world have done, has indicated that going to the moon is the right next step as a balance for all the stakeholder interests. Now, that said, that doesn't mean that there isn't an opportunity to partner with SpaceX, right? SpaceX will invest in capabilities that may be useful in exploring the moon, and NASA may be advancing capabilities that may be useful to Elon Musk's efforts to explore Mars. And we certainly understand how to land things on Mars. So we know in the future we want to land people on Mars. So there's a lot of opportunity to work together, both in the lunar program and the Mars program. But that's the main reason why we're not in lockstep with Elon.
Hey, Kathy, we have to board the bus and go someplace. We have to leave, but we wanna all thank you for taking your time and respond to me, Kathy. I reached out to you on LinkedIn.
And your teacher knows how to find me. So if anybody has any questions, you can reach out via email, and I'm happy to answer your questions.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, I'm standing right in front of you. Thank you. The has arrived a little earlier, so this was fascinating. I can't thank you enough for your time, and I will reach out again because the stuff that you offered, my students are going to be focusing so much on, and if you wouldn't mind speaking with them another time, I would greatly appreciate it.
Okay, whatever I can do to help. You know how to find me.
Yes, great. Thank you so much. Have a great day.
All right, you too. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Well,